Welcome to this second session in the series on the Eightfold Path. The first session was an overview of the Eightfold Path, and in this second session we will go into some detail on the first element, which is called right view. Before we get into that, I want to just give a brief recap from the previous session. If you're familiar with the Four Noble Truths, you know that it's talking about suffering. We use this word dukkha in Pali, which suffering's a fine word. It really includes more than that, that life has an uncertain or an unreliable or an uncontrollable quality to it. And so that if we're clinging and holding on to things being a certain way or not being another way, then it's an unreliable happiness, because we know things invariably change. Matter of fact, this understanding is an important aspect of right view, holding that view of how things are. So that was in the Four Noble Truths, and they deal with dukkha, suffering. The second noble truth was what was the cause, and the cause was craving, which basically means, having to have or having to get away from not have something, so much so that we can't let go and can't be with it. The third noble truth was that there is an end to the craving, and the fourth noble truth was what's the way to develop this, and that's the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path, each of the elements begins with the word right. The word in Pali is samma. There's nothing wrong with the word right. Most translations do use it, so I will use the term right here, but we have to be careful because it can have a connotation of right or wrong, and like a judgmentalness, and that's not the idea. It's like, what would be the right or the proper thing to do to attain a certain result with anything? So that's what we mean. So probably a better translation than right would be wise or skillful, but we'll just use the word right as a shorthand, again, since pretty much everybody does. So let me just briefly name the elements of the Eightfold Path. It begins with right view, then right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right samadhi. The word samadhi gets translated as concentration. We'll talk about that later. It's not the best translation, but we'll just use the word samadhi. And it's divided into three groups. The first two, right view and right intention, are called the wisdom group, punya in Pali, the wisdom group. The next three are the morality group, sila in Pali, right speech, right action, right livelihood. And the third group is the samadhi group, you could say the concentration group, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. The way to understand these is that we begin with wanting to have the right understanding or the right view. That's what we'll get into in just a few moments. Even as we begin, we want to have an understanding of where are we aiming, why, and what can we do, what's the right ways to act, and the qualities to develop in ourselves that will support us to further along to get to our aims. So, and then we have our intention after that. So we start with that. We want to reflect on those as we begin practice, and we carry that intellectual understanding with us. The sila group, the right speech, right action, right livelihood, is all about wise action, how we live in our daily activities in the world. Then the final group is the samadhi group. It's also about action, but in particular about formal meditation when it's talking about right effort, right mindfulness, and concentration. So you can think of this, the Eightfold Path, as a progression, but they're all always kind of at work at the same time. No matter what we're doing, we want to have right view, we want to have our mindfulness, we want to be able to steady our minds in the samadhi. So they all come to play all the time. Normally it is laid out as a progression, as I've done. There's called the wisdom, then the sila, and the samadhi group. There's another way it's talked about. It's called sila samadhi panya, where it starts with the morality group, right speech, right action, right livelihood, then moves to the meditative group, the samadhi group, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, and then it ends with the wisdom group. thinking of it that way is basically referring to a maturation of the practice, or maturation of the path. So as we now begin our discussion on right effort, we will discuss it in both ways. In this session, we'll focus on the intellectual understanding of right view, and then in the next session, we will focus on as it shifts from just being intellectual, where it's experiential. And we'll say more about that later. Even then, we might still have an intellectual understanding. We don't lose that. But it becomes more integrated in us and becomes more a part of us, even if we're not consciously thinking of it that much. And that's more of a maturing of right view. So right view's talked about. There's a lot of details. If you look at the old text, there's a lot of details on how it's laid out. Basically, it's just referring to what are the attitudes, the views that will inform our practice in a way that leads to less and less suffering and more well-being. That's the basics of what right view is. And the rest is just all the details of what is that. So let's back up just for a moment and let's pay attention to the ways that just as human beings, probably all of us live a lot of our lives. Most of us, whether we're conscious of it or not, spend a lot of time trying to hold on to certain experiences and avoid other experiences. That's natural. You're not doing anything wrong. That's what human beings, all living beings do. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't think anyone's going to stop doing that. Of course, nobody wants to have more of the experiences you don't want, more unpleasant, and have less good, pleasant experience. You have less of what you want. So that sounds kind of silly. So that's pretty obvious, and that's normal. The problem is, and it goes back to the Four Noble Truths, this word dukkha, an aspect of all experience, of all reality, is that things are constantly changing. Knowing that is an element of right view, keeping that in mind. No matter what experience one can have, even if it gives us some happiness and satisfaction in the moment, won't ultimately last. Doesn't mean we push away those experiences and we can appreciate them, but they aren't going to ultimately give us the satisfaction we need, because everything is ultimately lost and it changes. We have a certain amount of control over these. This is also right view, an element of right view. How much control do we have? We all know that we do have some control, but due to various causes and conditions, things happen that are out of our control. So sometimes you get what you want in life, sometimes you don't, and sometimes you get what you don't want. So another way to think of right view is we start to know that a more reliable pathway to well-being and happiness is to not only seek our well-being in having or not having certain experiences. Again, yes, that's important, and we will do the best we can on that. But we add in a piece, which is we start to change how we relate to whatever's happening. And this is the path that we cultivate in all these other elements, that if we can shift our understanding that things are coming and going and changing, then when things invariably change, we don't have to have so much trouble about it. We can understand this is how things are. And this manifests in many ways. It not only manifests in our experience in life, things that come to us, internal and external, but even our own bodies are always changing. And we may not notice it day to day, but of course we all know that our bodies eventually age. We can have sickness, things go wrong in the body, we get a certain amount of suffering that comes with getting older. We all know that if you were to reflect on it, but part of right view is understanding that we tend not to live our lives as if it's true. We forget. So right view is also knowing we need to cultivate qualities like mindfulness and like steadiness. This is the samadhi. So we're more present, more clear, more awake, more clearly knowing what's happening. So we can have an awareness not only that things are changing, but we are aware of how much we tend to hold on and cling, and how hard it can be to let go around things. And we also recognize then that this is also right view, that maybe the essence of the whole path is learning about non-clinging, learning how to let go when we are clinging, not just as a good idea, but how to do that. That's the whole path of practice. We may say, well, that sounds like a good idea. I want to learn to be in a more harmonious flow in relationship to life. That's good. We all want that. I want to learn to let go when I'm clinging more. But then we find out that you can do it in a given moment, but all it takes is the right circumstances, the right causes and conditions to come together again, and we're caught right back. So right view is understanding that we do have these tendencies. We want to try to shift our habitual responses to what happens to us, and we start to know what are some of the qualities that help us deepen what is called liberation through non-clinging. So then what are qualities? This is another piece of right view. I would say, you could talk about it in many ways, but I'd say one way to sum it up is you could put it in 4 main categories. We want to deepen what we call mindfulness. We'll discuss it more when we get to that element of the Eightfold Path. Mindfulness is defined, I'll just do a quick definition. It's defined in many different ways. There's the practice of mindfulness, and there's the mental state of being mindful. My definition of the mental state of being mindful is very simple. It just means not being lost on automatic pilot, not being caught up and entangled with what's happening. An example would be if something happens and you get angry, you are having the experience, but we're just so lost and caught in it, we're identified and we just react out of it. When we, so to speak, wake up and realize, oh, I'm angry, we know what's happening, then we're disentangling from it. We're still experiencing it, but then it gives us a little space, perhaps, to at least give us a chance to have some choice points in how we respond. We don't always have choice points because, depending on what's happening, if the strength or the quality is of such a nature, it can still take us over. We'll discuss that more when we get to the right mindfulness element of the Eightfold Path. But deepening our mindfulness is essential. What supports us in that is the samadhi, which is the concentration. Basically means steadying our mind, so we're not just lost and our mind jumping all over the place, but we can really have a steady, awake, clear presence. We talk about insights, which is a big topic, but it basically is talking about understanding these processes that I'm discussing here. As we get clear on it, you could say we're having insight into these things, intellectually and then more experientially. And also an important piece is developing the good heart, the qualities of love, sometimes called loving kindness, that's fine, compassion, empathy, not shutting off from connection with ourselves and with others. This is a big topic. So right view also understands that developing these qualities is to our betterment. Another way it's talked about, I'll give you just one more that it's talked about in the old texts, is there's 3 qualities, greed, hatred, and delusion. Greed is a euphemism that just basically means any time we're caught in the wanting mind. It can be a little bit, but when it gets really strong, they just use the word greed. It's just, wanting more pleasant, holding on to it. There's nothing wrong with enjoying something if it's pleasant, as long as, when you're done, you let go and you move on, right? That's no problem. We'll do that all the time. But it's when you have to have, and it's hard to be without or hard to let go, or you're constantly striving and seeking or chasing after something, that's more the greed, because it tends to drive us then. We'd have less freedom and choice, and we're impelled along by that force. The opposite of the greed is what's called hatred. It's also a euphemism. It just means anytime, instead of wanting more of what we want, it's getting away from or getting it away from us some unwanted, unpleasant, difficult experiences. Same thing. When difficulties arise, many times we're able to be with it. We understand what's happening. We can work with it. We can let go around it. But when it gets stronger, or if our ability is not well cultivated, it's harder. And so that's the greed, hatred. And then delusion can take many forms. I don't have time to get into it in much detail, but it's basically, it can be not seeing, having mistaken views about things, or not seeing things clearly. And I'll just leave that at, well, I'll tell one example of a deluded view would be thinking that the way to happiness is fulfilling desires. We should clarify, fulfilling desires can lead to we all know this, a happiness in the moment. It doesn't last. One thing that can happen about when we're caught in a lot of craving for something, that can be very unsettling and quite unpleasant, because we're sort of consumed with something. We can't get it out of our mind, and we're just thinking about it and obsessing about it, say, if that's ever happened to you. That's pretty unpleasant. If you can fulfill the desire, that it's a relief. Not necessarily the experience of what you've fulfilled itself, although that could feel good. But if it ever happens to you again, notice that there's just the relief of that craving has dropped away. It's the end of the craving that really gave you the relief. So we see what fulfilling desires can do for us, but we want to understand its inherent limitations. That would be a wisdom or a right view. And it's, instead of having a delusion about what it can do for us, we have a clarity and a wisdom about what's happening. So these are different ways we can think of understanding what the aim of the practice, the goals, and we didn't get into a lot of detail on the cultivating these, but the basic ideas of the kind of qualities that can help us. We come to see that when greed, hatred, and delusion in any combinations are present, it's not for our welfare. It's and when we can liberate ourselves, when greed, hatred, and delusion are not operative, we're in a more of an equanimous, peaceful relationship with ourselves and with all our experience.